The Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, brought to you today by Josh Edison and Dr. M. Dentith. Hello and welcome to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. I am Josh Edison, sitting somewhere in New Zealand. They are Dr. M. Dentith sitting somewhere else in New Zealand. That's the kind of wacky mixed up world we live in. How's
and that's
things?
all the information that we are willing to give you. Things are fine. How are things in your nondescript part of the country?
They're quite literally things. Occasionally stuff, but you know.
It is sounding a bit heady. I hope it isn't bringing up the old anxiety.
No, well, I don't. Maybe that's a good thing. They've been all in the news at the moment, saying now just be ready in case we get another wave of COVID here. Everything's fine now, but we don't want to become complacent, which I guess is fair enough. Which some people have taken to be saying there will be a second wave, which has then caused other people to say, what do they know that they're not telling us? But I assume all they're actually telling us is don't let your guard down and be ready for things to turn south as they have in other countries.
Well, I think people are very much aware in the medical profession here and the government that countries which appeared to be doing well, like Vietnam and also Australia to a certain extent, are suddenly doing very, very badly due to the super spreaders in their communities, basically. And we're going, well, we're actually not that different. And at the moment, we think we've contained the virus to the borders of the country. But that doesn't necessarily mean that someone hasn't snuck through who is asymptomatic and hasn't come up with a test, because we have the problem of false positives and false negatives with respect to COVID-19. So it is possible there's at least one person with COVID-19 out in the community, and we might not detect that for several weeks. And when we do detect it, it could be because there's a wave. So we need to be very cautious.
Yes, so things are still fine here for the moment. Did you hear that loud door slamming? My house is a hotbed of activity. There was a helicopter circling the house not too long ago either. I'm not quite sure what's going on.
What kind of crime ring are you running?
I don't... A car ran into the streetlight outside my house just last week. It's madness. I mean, it's bedlam.
It appears to be a criminal hotbed of activity in your city. What are you doing?
Well, I don't know. I can only assume I'm some sort of magnet. But enough about me.
Magnets, how do they work, though?
Nobody knows. That's the point. So we should just discard any thought of them. And maybe...
Just a juggalo everywhere I go. Sorry, please do continue.
Do you know that has never actually occurred to me to juxtapose those two songs? So, well done.
Oh, I do it all the time. Yeah.
No, anyway, as to the episode to hand, it's another episode of Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre. So things are... This one, I mean, the stuff we've looked at so far, there's been disagreement and back and forth, but it all seems to be fairly agreeable. But this one seems to be a bit more contrary, so it should be a little bit more interesting. Yes,
we are about to encounter, and I say this kindly, the grumpy old man of the philosophy of conspiracy theory, I should say Dr. David Coady.
And his paper Conspiracy Theories and Official Stories. So, unless you have anything else you want to get off your chest, shall we pile into the episode proper?
Indeed. Let's play a sting. Okay, so this week we are looking at Conspiracy Theories and Official Stories by David Coady, which was published in the International Journal of Applied Philosophy back in 2003. That's volume 17, issue 2, pages 197 to 209, for those who are playing along at home. It has an abstract, Josh, that goes something like this.
Was that my cue to say it?
It was, yes.
Okay, sorry, you said it like that, I thought you... Anyway. Conspiracy theories have a bad reputation. This is especially true in the academy and in the media. Within these institutions, to describe someone as a conspiracy theorist is often to imply that his or her views should not be taken seriously. Perhaps this accounts for the fact that philosophers have tended to ignore the topic despite the enduring appeal of conspiracy theories in popular culture. Recently, however, some philosophers have at least treated conspiracy theories respectfully enough to try to articulate where they go wrong. I begin this paper by clarifying the nature of conspiracy theories. I then argue against some recent critiques of conspiracy theories. Many criticisms of conspiracy theories are unfounded. I also argue that unwillingness to entertain conspiracy theories is an intellectual and moral failing. I end by suggesting an Aristotelian approach to the issue, according to which the intellectual virtue of realism is a golden mean between the intellectual vices of paranoia and naivety.
I like how you go naivety like I do, even though many people go naivete.
Naivete, well, it's spelt with a Y. We're not French. We're English speakers, at any rate. We absorb words into our own language like some sort of linguistic amoeba, and that's the way we like it.
I'd prefer to think of it more like a cephalopod, but you know, whatever floats your goat.
So, that's how it starts, and straight away, I mean, we can see, much like most of the commentaries we've looked at before, we've looked at already, the idea that yes, actually, you shouldn't just be writing off conspiracy theories entirely. It is an intellectual and moral failing to at least refuse to entertain them. But as we'll see fairly quickly, things diverge a little in the specifics of it. So this paper mentions Charles Pigden at the start and mentions Lee Basham at the end, but mostly it's a commentary on Brian L. Keeley's Of Conspiracy Theories and Steve Clark's Conspiracy Theories and Conspiracy Theorizing, which we've already covered in this series. So a lot of the stuff in the beginning is going to sound familiar.
But
now,
importantly, this is the first time 9/11 gets
it is
mentioned
actually,
in
yes.
philosophical literature. It was 2003, and Coady is going to talk about how any standard explanation of 9/11 is a conspiracy theory when you consider a conspiracy theory properly. What is interesting, given it's a 2003 paper, there's no talk of the inside job set of conspiracy theories. There's no Lee Hop or Me Hop, because they have not emerged in the literature yet. So it's kind of an interesting look at a point where 9/11 is used as an example in the conspiracy theory literature, as an example of an official theory which cites a conspiracy without any of the weirder conspiracy theories also impinging on that commentary.
So, Dr. Coady begins basically by looking at the definition of a conspiracy theory that Brian Keeley and Steve Clark both subscribe to and taking issue with it in some areas. And I have to say, on reading this for the first time, as I did the other day, my feeling is that there's a bit of a I don't know. There seems to be a little bit of talking at cross purposes at times. Reading through it, it seems like Coady has a sort of an unstated assumption that the definition of conspiracy theory should match fairly closely the way it's used in the common parlance, which is quite Aristotelian. Did you do ancient Greek philosophy when you were
I did, yes,
in the department? Yeah.
It's one of the things, right? You did quite a lot of it, but I still don't quite understand why we spend so much time on the ancient Greeks whilst ignoring recent contributions to the literature.
But anyway, one of the things I recall from when I did it, 20-something years ago now, was that Aristotle likes to start a lot of his things by saying, when we talk about whatever subject he's discussing, here's what we say, and he would use the way the way things are commonly talked about as a guide to reach an understanding of them. And so Coady does seem to be, although he doesn't explicitly say this, what he says only made sense to me if we were to assume that he's thinking that the definition of conspiracy theory we use should match the more colloquial one. So right at the start, he said, where is it? He says, this definition does not quite capture the ordinary usage of the expression conspiracy theory. And my reaction on reading that was, well, yeah, but like, isn't that the point? It seemed to me that the likes of Keeley and Clark find the colloquial definition of conspiracy theory not fit for purpose in an epistemological sense, and so they have no problem with the fact that it doesn't actually match the ordinary usage. Is that like that was my impression, but as someone who's a lot more familiar with the literature, is that what you see?
So what's interesting about Coady's work is actually talking about this paper with respect to what he's going to argue in future papers. So you are right, there's something interesting about his appeal to ordinary or common usage, because in subsequent papers and most of Coady's recent work, he actually doesn't want people to use the term conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist, because they are pejorative terms that mark out theories as being mad, bad, and dangerous, and they play a policing role of basically marking out things you're not meant to talk about. So Cody's current work is to go, look, we shouldn't be even bothering with a philosophical or psychological or cultural theory study of these things called conspiracy theories. Even engaging in the language is bad. And that kind of appeals to the ordinary usage stuff he's referring to here, where he's going, well, look, if we work with Steve Clark or Brian L. Keeley's notion of what a conspiracy theory is, then these things are going to be amenable to a standard analytic analysis of conspiracy theories which are rational to believe versus conspiracy theories which are irrational to believe. That's not how people talk about conspiracy theories in ordinary language. They always take them to be theories which are irrational to believe, even though the philosopher will say there are cases where conspiracy theories are prima facie rational given particular evidence and the like. And we should be working with ordinary language usage whenever possible to try and capture how people talk about these things. Now, of course, you know from my work, I disagree. I think a stipulative definition is the way to go about these things because it helps with the analysis of these things called conspiracy theories. But no, Coady has a very different start point, and I think that then explains a lot of where this article and his subsequent work is going to go.
Mm. So he carries on looking at the sort of Keeley-Clark definition. He says the first thing he has to say of it is that the requirement that the number of conspirators be relatively small is quite counterintuitive. He seems to think that we assume that sort of conspiracy theories could have lots of people in them, and indeed sort of the more conspiratorial a theory is, the more people will be involved, which I don't know. I just kind of glossed past that. Really, it seemed an interesting point, but didn't really seem to have much of a bearing on anything. But he goes on to say,
well, no. So there's one other point there, which is kind of interesting. So he's going, look, this idea that conspiracies are meant to be small for them to be plausible is kind of odd because the really big conspiracies seem to be the most exemplar form of conspiracy theory we find in literature. And then he goes, look, the more members of a conspiracy, the more conspiratorial that conspiracy is going to be. And that just seems like a really odd thing to say, because surely a conspiracy is a conspiracy, whether there are two people working in secret towards some end, or 4,922 people working in secret towards some end. As soon as two or more people work in secret towards some end, it is conspiratorial. It's not more conspiratorial if there are more people involved. It's just a bigger conspiracy.
yes, no, an odd thing to say, but doesn't have much bearing on what comes next. Now, what does come next, though, is Coady says a more significant problem with the Keeley-Clark definition is that it lacks any requirement of success. And yeah, that was the first thing that really struck me. That only makes sense if you're insisting that the definition has to be more like the colloquial definition. Because I mean, I've said in the past, I remember one time I was about to head off to go and record an episode back when we co-located. And my wife had a friend over, and we were just saying as I left, I'm about to go off and do this podcast about conspiracy theories, and she said, "Oh, so what are you talking about?" And I said, we're doing the Volkswagen emissions scandal," and then she seemed surprised. It was kind of like, "How's that a conspiracy theory?" Because A, it's true, and B, it kind of didn't work. But That was sort of the colloquial understanding. But for the way Keeley and Clark define conspiracy theories, like I don't see that's a problem for their definition at all. And I think even sort of in a more colloquial, quote unquote, real world sense, I wasn't sure about that one really because like if you look at say the legal world, conspiracy to commit fraud, commit murder or whatever is a completely different crime from say murder. And if it was part of a conspiracy's definition that it had to be successful, then those would kind of be one and the same crime, really. The fact that you can be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder without actually successfully murdering anyone would suggest that even outside of the academic definition, that one doesn't really apply so much.
And indeed, there's a kind of weirdness to anything which is a success criteria when it comes to conspiracy, which is how are we measuring success? So take, for example, the assassination of Julius Caesar, an example that I mention an awful lot in my PhD thesis. Depending on who you talk to, that was either a very successful or a very unsuccessful conspiracy. Because one of the aims of the conspiracy was the killing of the dictator, Julius Caesar. But one of the other aims of the conspiracy was to elevate Brutus to a position of power within the Roman Republic and basically replacing Caesar as dictator. So on one level, they were successful in removing one dictator and absolute failures in replacing that dictator with another in the form of Brutus, because as we know, you end up getting Augustus as Caesar in the end. So once you start bringing in the idea that you need to measure a conspiracy theory with respect to success of the secretive plot of conspirators, then you also open up a huge can of worms as to, so what do we mean by success in this particular situation? Including, as you point out, examples of things which are clearly conspiracies, even though they actually failed to achieve anything. Although, of course, with the VW thing, they achieved things for a while. They just didn't achieve the ultimate success of never being
Getting away with it, yes. And indeed, if you look at, say, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which was certainly the result of a conspiracy, I'm quite certain the conspirators didn't intend to start a world war. And yet an explanation of the start of the world war surely involves this thing which we would want to call a conspiracy. So it's sort of
Precisely.
The goals and what actually happens can diverge quite a lot. So there's that, and then furthermore, Coady goes on to say the most important feature missing from the Keeley-Clark definition is the requirement that a conspiracy theory conflict with an official explanation of the event in question. And so again, my reading of that is, sorry, who says a conspiracy theory has to conflict with an official explanation of the event? And indeed, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know that's sort of one of the things we've explicitly at times said a conspiracy theory doesn't have to involve. But again, I suppose, and I think that this is possibly more what my wife's friend was thinking of with the VW thing, because it was very much an official announcement that VW had been up to these dodgy things. So if again you think it should match with people's colloquial use of the term, then yeah, okay. People do often think that you have the official version and the conspiracy theory. You have the official version of the Kennedy assassination and the conspiracy theories, the official version of what happened in 9/11 and the conspiracy theories, even though we would say that they're both conspiracy theories.
And I mean, there's a metaphysical issue here, which is what happens when your conspiracy theory becomes the official theory over a period of time. The Moscow show trials being a great example of this. It was a conspiracy theory that they were sham or mock trials run by Stalin according to the Coady story here. But now it's the accepted orthodoxy that actually it was a giant conspiracy by the Soviets to hide the fact that the trials were shams. So it started off as a pejorative conspiracy theory in opposition to an official theory that the trials were free and fair, and now it's accepted that the official theory was in fact a conspiracy theory by the Soviets to cover up the fact that the conspiracy theory that the Soviets were lambasting as being disinformation was in fact actually the official theory. Now the trials were a sham. You just don't need to bring in this official theory stuff to talk about conspiracy theories. It does more harm than good.
Yeah, and I think, as I recall, this is going to come up again a little bit later, and it's perhaps not as much of a problem for Coady as it might appear, but still. So yeah, I mean, continuing in this line, he says both Holocaust acceptance and Holocaust denial fit the Keeley-Clark definition of a conspiracy theory, and he means this as a criticism, and yet I would just say, yeah, that's true. The official version of 9/11 is a conspiracy theory.
It's only a problem if you assume that conspiracy theories have to conflict with some kind of official theory. But if Keeley and Clark don't require that, then it's not a problem for their particular view.
So Coady, from his particular view, ends up recommending the following three-part definition. A conspiracy theory is a proposed explanation of a historical event in which conspiracy, i.e. agents acting secretly in concert, has a significant causal role. Furthermore, the conspiracy postulated by the proposed explanation must be a conspiracy to bring about the historical event which it purports to explain. Finally, the proposed explanation must conflict with an official explanation of the same historical event. The last part of this definition rules out the possibility of an official explanation of an event qualifying as a conspiracy theory, no matter how conspiratorial it is. To me, that just feels contrived. It just feels official. You've taken the definition and then slapped a couple more criteria on the end of it just because. But again, that's because he's coming from another angle.
Yeah, he's trying to make the terminology fit ordinary usage. Now, the problem with this is it's actually not clear that ordinary usage precludes official theories from being conspiracy theories. People have studied this, people like Michael J. Wood, and if we ever move away from simply doing the philosophical literature to looking at the social psychological literature, we'll encounter his work. And Wood has looked at the way that people talk about conspiracy theories when you poll them, and it turns out that people don't think that conspiracy theories are necessarily in opposition to some official theory about the world. So it turns out it's not clear that ordinary usage says conspiracy theories are unwarranted theories that go against conventional wisdom. So you don't need to do any of this work because it's actually not clear ordinary usage is easily captured by it anyway.
So having got the definitions out of the way, he starts looking more at Brian L. Keeley's paper. He does point out, as other people have, as we've seen, that Keeley has a little bit of a problem in that he sort of switches sometimes between specifically talking about unwarranted conspiracy theories and just conspiracy theories, and it's not always clear, has he now switched to actually talking about conspiracy theories in general, or does he still mean unwarranted conspiracy theories and he's just using that, he's just shortening the phrase, which Coady seems to take as possibly a little bit sinister, but I'm not sure if that wasn't any more than just carelessness on Keeley's behalf.
And I think in part because Brian and Charles were kind of
you just choked to death there. Yeah.
Brian and Charles.
Why can't they just get on? It's so.
I mean, they've got the same idea. Well, I think because they're both basically creating a literature out of whole cloth, it's understandable that there's some language slippage going on in that discussion. It's easy to ping people after the fact for not being cautious about the way they use terms, but when people are inventing terminology to discuss some phenomenon, it's understandable they may not get it right every single time.
But at any rate, that was more of a side note, really. Coady goes on to look at Keeley's claims about errant data. So you'll recall that in his paper, Brian L. Keeley talks about the fact that conspiracy theories can be attractive because they can explain away errant data that looks like it could be a problem for the official theory, and yet Keeley's point is that, well, actually that's kind of a problem because in any set of data, some of the data is going to be wrong. And so any theory that looks to explain every single little bit of data, even stuff that looks like it might be errant, it might conflict with the main theory in some way, you should probably actually be suspicious of. But Coady goes in a different direction. He says, Keeley and Clark are wrong, however, to claim that conspiracy theories always attempt to explain more than the received alternative does. Conspiracy theories do tend to offer putative explanations of data unexplained by or apparently in conflict with the received alternative, but the received alternative will also, unless it is a transparent fabrication, attempt to explain data unexplained by or apparently in conflict with its conspiratorial rivals. And it seemed to me he seemed to be getting towards the fact that it's not just that it's not necessarily that conspiracy theories explain more data. Sometimes they pick different data as being salient. Is that more where he's
so
going?
the example he uses is if you take the official theory for the assassination of JFK by the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, the official theory says there were 3 shots fired. Now this data is errant to a whole bunch of conspiracy theories about the assassination of JFK that claim there were more shots fired. So those theories have to explain away why an awful lot of ear witnesses to the assassination report 3 and only 3 gunshots. That data is errant to the conspiracy theories about JFK's death. Now, part of the problem for Coady's account here is he's going, well, look, Keeley's wrong because he talks about errant data, and errant data applies to non-conspiratorial official theories of the same explanation. But of course, as we saw earlier in the paper, Keeley doesn't have to bite the bullet on conspiracy theories having to be contra some official theory of the event anyway. So Keeley can go, yeah, you're right. If there's more than one conspiracy theory for a particular event, then it is going to be the case that one of those conspiracy theories, which may have been endorsed by people in positions of authority, also has data errant to some rival conspiracy theory, which hasn't been endorsed by someone in a position of authority. So there's no particular issue for my account, says Keeley, if you're making this claim.
And then we see something similar when he goes on to look at Keeley's claims about skepticism. If you recall, Keeley's, at least in his initial of conspiracy theories, said that really the biggest thing, the biggest problem with these unwarranted conspiracy theories is that they can, as they go on, they require you to become more skeptical and more skeptical, in the sense that, you think the moon landings were faked. Well, hang on, NASA says it wasn't. Okay, well, all of NASA must be into it. We can't believe what they say, but it was also on TV. Okay, well, we can't believe anything the news says. And then the government said, well, we can't believe anything the government says. And they can sort of snowball until you're having to be skeptical of everything, which is not practical, or I guess epistemologically virtuous, would you say? I don't know.
Yeah.
But Coady doesn't really buy that, although it seemed a little bit pedantic to me, some of his objections. He really zooms in on things like their talk about Holocaust revisionists and so on, by saying, well, actually, these Holocaust revisionists, David Irving, the main one being, isn't a universal skeptic, and says he doesn't believe in this conspiracy theory because he's skeptical of everything. He believes in it because he's an anti-Semite. He says, so Coady says, the quote, Keeley and Wilson may admit all this, but insist that their point is not that Holocaust revisionists actually tend to be radical skeptics, but just that their views entail radical skepticism, an entailment that they may or may not recognise. I don't agree. As noted, a conspiracy theory, unlike a skeptical hypothesis, is offered as an actual explanation, not as an alternative possible explanation. The radical conspiracy theorist seeks not to undermine belief as such, but to replace our current beliefs with different beliefs, which didn't really make sense to me as an objection. If you're saying that these conspiracy theories entail a overly skeptical viewpoint, even if the people making it don't actually realise that that's what they're ultimately implying is, then why does it matter that they don't intend to undermine belief. That just means they haven't followed their views to the logical endpoint of it.
Yeah, and actually this is the point where when I was having a conversation with Keeley a few weeks ago, he actually wants to chase this up because he feels that this is something which people have not really paid much attention to. Because yes, it's not the case that people who put forward these conspiracy theories like Holocaust denialism are trying to engender radical skepticism. It's more to generate that particular hypothesis in the first place requires you to distrust the way that we normally form knowledge in our epistemic communities, which means you give up on a whole lot of bases for knowledge in your epistemic community, which means that as a consequence, you must become quite skeptical about a lot of other things that come from the same bases as well. So you might not be willing to admit that actually, if I doubt this thing, I should doubt this thing as well. But it should be a consequence to anyone who is analyzing your view to go, yeah, but if you believe this, then how can you believe this, and this as well without being inconsistent?
Mm. And I think at this day and age, there are a lot more arguments that show, or examples rather, that show this a bit more clearly. I mean, especially the QAnon stuff. I mean, here you have people who basically seem to be quite happy to say, yep, can't trust anything except Donald Trump and Q, essentially. All media, all mainstream media, can't trust any of that. All the politicians, all the Democrats, all of them, it's the swamp, it's the deep state, can't trust any of that. And they seem quite happy with that level of skepticism, although, as a side note, one of the things that sticks with me a little bit is the fact that you have all these people saying you can't trust anything at all, except me. And these YouTube videos that I've looked at. Believe me when I say what I'm saying, but completely distrust anything else. We had an interesting email just this week that you forwarded to me of someone wanting to talk to us about how COVID's fake and obviously a psyop, which you can see when you compare it to the 9/11 psyop, and lots of psyops, all the ops.
Yes, I have not responded to
No.
that email yet.
I can't see any good coming off that.
I've got the right set of mind to go, okay, so here's my response to these particular claims.
Mm. And now, here's the point that we mentioned before. Still talking about Holocaust revisionism and skepticism, what have you. Coady says, although here and now belief in the Holocaust does not qualify as a conspiracy theory because it also has official status, there was a time and place, i.e. Nazi-occupied Europe, in which what would now be called Holocaust revisionism was the official story, and belief in the Holocaust was belief in an accurate conspiracy theory. To believe in the Holocaust was to deny the official story that the Jews were merely being resettled. And that was what jumped out at me and said exactly what you just said before. So hang on, so that means that if a conspiracy theory can't be an official theory, and yet it's possible for something to go from being official to being unofficial or vice versa, that means it's possible for something to go from being a conspiracy theory to not being a conspiracy theory, even though the actual content of the theory hasn't changed in any way. And that immediately I was like, oh, hang on, that sounds like a problem. Although reading further down, it didn't actually sound like a problem for Coady, given what he ends up saying eventually. As we'll see, he talks about saying that sort of the social context is important. So if the context changes, I guess he would say, yeah, actually that's fine. If the context changes, then whether or not it's a conspiracy changes, because the social context is important.
But that also becomes a problem if you think that we should be trying to map conspiracy theory onto an ordinary language use, because that shows that the ordinary language use of what conspiracy theory is not settled, which means why try and capture an unsettled notion of what counts as a conspiracy theory if that's subject to change? Why not work with a stipulative definition that says it's one particular thing, and then do the analysis and add in that in your language community you may have an initial intuitive response to this, but here's a reason to disregard it.
So having looked at that, he then turns his eye to Steve Clark's conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorizing, which, if you recall, when we looked at that, Steve Clark, at least in his initial paper, said that he believed that Keely was wrong and that the real thing that makes conspiracy theories unwarranted is that they rely on the fundamental attribution error, the psychological phenomenon where people, what's the terminology again? They look for a dispositional explanation rather than a
Yeah,
situational one. Have I
yeah,
got that right
yeah.
around here? And Coady basically says that he thinks that's wrong because the fundamental attribution error is wrong, and that people don't actually make this mistake. And he refers to other psychological studies that have been done that he thinks shows that the fundamental attribution error is not true. Which uh, is that okay? Is that kosher to be in one
Yeah, no,
discipline talking about whether the something in another discipline is right or wrong?
it's basically pointing out that the kind of studies that argue for the fundamental attribution error tend to overplay dispositional factors and underplay situational factors. So to actually find, to then go, well, hold on, the description of the state of affairs you've provided hinges entirely upon saying X has disposition Y and downplaying situation Z. But actually, if we talk about how situation Z impacts upon disposition Y, then that changes the entire story for X. So that, and I mean, it's not cited here, but Coady is getting this criticism from people who are criticizing the fundamental attribution
Mm.
error in the in the domain of psychology. So it is actually a problem which is admitted to there as well.
Okay. But yes, right or wrong, at any rate, he eventually points out a problem that you get with appealing to the fundamental attribution error. As he puts it, the problem is not just that there's insufficient evidence for the existence of the fundamental attribution error, it's that belief in the phenomenon is itself deeply paradoxical. Those who say there's a widespread tendency to commit the fundamental attribution error themselves seem to be committing that very error. After all, if we do exaggerate the importance of dispositions in our explanations of behaviour, this is itself a disposition, which purports to explain a great deal of our behaviour. The more we explain by appeal to the fundamental attribution error, the more we will ourselves be committing the fundamental attribution error. Belief in the fundamental attribution error appears to be self-refuting in much the same way that naive set theory and logical positivism are, and that's too many times to say the phrase fundamental attribution error in a short amount of time. But I think I managed it.
Congratulations, well done. You probably deserve an award.
Probably. So yes, interesting point. That yeah, I mean, we ended up not being convinced, as I recall, by Steve Clark's appeal to the fundamental attribution error anyway. But that does seem to be a more forceful way, I guess, of arguing against appeals to it.
Yeah, and I mean, the problem with the fundamental attribution error is it does tend to present explanations as being predominantly dispositional and ignoring the fact that the said explanations also engage in situational factors as well. So it's quite easy to take any dispositional explanation and then recast it in situational terms, at which point the FAE just disappears. And that's the problem with the FAE analysis. It kind of goes, dispositions are really important, and then people go, but hold on, redescribe the situation in situational terms, and the dispositions don't seem particularly important at all. So, are they?
And frankly, this is all beyond my ken, to be honest, your fundamental attribution errors and what have you, so I'll just take their word for it. And so having looked at Keely and then looked at Clark, Coady comes up to his conclusion, which again, I was left with the feeling that they're sort of talking past each other a little bit. He says, both Clark and Keely contrast conspiracy theories with their official non-conspiratorial rivals. And I thought, do they? It has been a little while, I guess, since we've talked about them. What do they say about official theories, if anything?
Not
Because
particularly much.
I couldn't remember much. But anyway, Coady carries on. But quite often the official version of events is just as conspiratorial as its rivals. And again, I sort of read that and thought, yeah, and that's kind of what Keely and Clark say, isn't it? That the official version and the quote-unquote conspiracy theory version are both, or at least can both actually be conspiracy theories.
Now, of course, what might be happening here is that Coady might be engaging in entirely the thing that he criticized Keeley for, which is mixing up his unwarranted conspiracy theories with his conspiracy
Ah,
theories. Because when Keeley is talking about unwarranted conspiracy theories, mature conspiracy theories that have not amounted much evidence over time, and thus stink like a bad cheese, then they tend to exist in contrast to an accepted explanation of the event. But of course, that's only particular conspiracy theories, the unwarranted conspiracy theories, which have that particular issue. So Coady appears to be making the same mistake that he claims Keeley made, which is mixing up the broader class with the narrow class.
hmm. But so having said that official events can be just as conspiratorial as the unofficial, official theories can be just as conspiratorial as their rival theories, he says, when this is the case, it is the unofficial explanation that will inevitably attract the label conspiracy theory with all its negative connotations. The degree to which this label deserves those connotations depends to a large extent on the diversity and transparency of the mechanisms for gathering and disseminating information in the society in question. And so here he starts going into the stuff that we've seen Keeley talking about, and especially Lee Basham and Keeley going back and forth on the whole trustworthiness of society, public institutions, and all that sort. And as we've said, as we've said before, depending on the sort of society you live in, as you've talked about Romania being a much more conspiracy-ridden, I suppose, society. So therefore, in that sort of thing, your attitudes towards conspiracy theories might be different. And so he says, as we're looking at, the legitimacy of conspiracy theorizing is therefore highly dependent on social context. This means that we cannot hope to distinguish between warranted and unwarranted conspiracy theories on the basis of content alone. Which, when I read that, I was like, okay, so where I was saying before, gosh, isn't it a problem that a conspiracy could change, a theory could change from a conspiracy theory to not being a conspiracy theory because it's official now, even though the content doesn't change. Well, okay, maybe that's not a problem for Coady because he specifically says that the content alone isn't enough to say whether or not something's warranted or unwarranted.
Yeah.
And then out comes the Aristotle. And so again, as I saw this at the end, it made me think, okay, maybe this is where he's coming from at the beginning, a more Aristotelian rather bent. So I mean, Coady, like all of the other people we've read, doesn't want to say we should dismiss all conspiracy theories out of hand. He does want to be able to say, look, if we allow people to write stuff off as just a conspiracy theory, people as just a conspiracy theorist, that can be a bad thing. So we need to do something about that, and his proposal is I propose an Aristotelian approach to the issue, according to which the intellectual virtue of realism is a golden mean between the intellectual vices of paranoia and naivety. Paranoids will be predisposed to believe that, in their society at least, official information is untrustworthy. Naifs, on the other hand, will be inclined to believe the opposite. Both groups will hold their attitudes sacred. A realist, by contrast, adopts an attitude of reflective equilibrium toward official information on the one hand and conspiracy theories on the other. Her attitude towards conspiracy theories will depend on the extent of her prior trust in officialdom, but this trust will itself be open to the possibility of being undermined by warranted conspiracy theories. Now, I've got to say, I never quite got a handle on Aristotelian virtue ethics, but this does seem to be that kind of a thing, and I know there are a lot of virtue ethicists out there. So is this sort of virtue epistemology?
There is such a thing as virtue epistemology and vice epistemology. So if you're aware of how virtue ethics works, or the virtues work, the virtues are kind of a middle ground between the vices. So the virtue of honesty sits somewhere between the vice of being deceitful, but also the vice of being too honest. The honest person who has the virtue of honesty knows there are some situations where honesty is not the best policy. And you don't want to lie, but you want to get around having to state what you actually think. Such in a situation where honesty might get you killed, or may lead to a loved one feeling badly toward you. And so vice epistemology kind of deals with both of those particular extremes. That the virtue epistemologist is someone who has all the epistemic virtues that come from practical wisdom and allows them to have the right orientation towards knowing things about the world without being misled by the vices, which might make them either not get information or overinterpret information in a way which is vice-ridden.
Mm. So as a footnote, Coady says Aristotle spoke of the importance of identifying exemplars of the virtues to model ourselves on. Not surprisingly, the people I think of as exemplars of the virtue of realism are frequently portrayed as paranoid conspiracy theorists in the media and in the academy. A short list of people I consider exemplary realists would include Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, and Gore Vidal. I'm not quite sure why he thinks it's surprising that exemplars of the virtue of realism are often said to be paranoid conspiracy theorists. Is it just because he thinks that the media or the mainstream are too far towards the vice of naivety?
Also, I'd be a little bit cautious about two of the members of that group.
Well, yes,
So
2003 was
Said and Gord Vidal are not exactly people that I necessarily think of being exemplary thinkers. Said with Orientalism, and Gore Vidal with his really weird conspiracy theories about what America was actually doing during World War II and his isolationist policies, don't seem like realists as per se fantasists. But you know, that's just me.
That's anyway. As I say, that was a footnote, so it was just his little take on things. So now we come to the very end of it. So Coady's final words on the subject are: this raises the issue of how much of herself the realist will devote to pursuing conspiracy theories. On the one hand, Lee Basham is surely right that the constant search for evidence of conspiracy can blind us to what is good in life. Not only does paranoia endanger us epistemically, making both error and ignorance more likely, it can also undermine our happiness. On the other hand, naivety entails the same epistemic dangers and its own distinctive moral danger. The moral danger of excessive willingness to believe authority, like the moral danger of excessive willingness to obey authority, is moral cowardice. Naivety makes it too easy for us to think that we can avoid responsibility for a state of affairs by appealing to the fact that we were not told about it. We may have had a duty to find someone who can tell us. Internet technology has made it much easier for us to fulfill this obligation.
Now, I want to point out there's a bit of sleight of hand here in that he's going, on the one hand, Lee Basham says this thing, but on the other hand, consider this. But Lee Basham also says the stuff which is on the other hand. It's just that, at least in his earlier papers, he goes, well, look, what can you do? Pragmatically, you can't do anything against these malevolent global conspiracies. So you might as well act in a particular way. But he's also saying, even so, we need to be vigilant because eternal vigilance is the price of our freedom. And David's not really admitting that Lee is making that claim at the same time.
So what sort of effect has this had in the world of conspiracy theorizing? Because it seems there have been some slight sort of divisions in what we've seen, or at least people with different takes on the same thing. But this seems to be another division again. Are there schools of thought? Are there factions within conspiracy theorizing? How does this go?
I mean, there are factions in that you've got people like Kwasam Kassam, whose work we'll get to eventually, who exist in opposition to most of the rest of us writing in the philosophy of conspiracy theory. There really isn't a faction of, say, Keeley versus Basham versus Coady. There's more overlap of agreement than there is whole-scale disagreement. What does happen next is David Coady produces an edited collection on conspiracy theory for Ashgate, Conspiracy Theories, the Philosophical Debate, which this article is reprinted in as a chapter. And so very soon we'll be looking at the fruit of that particular work, which includes people like Pigden, like Keeley, like Basham, and like Clark. So what Coady does is generate subsequent discussion, which is basically where I come in, because the publication of Conspiracy Theories, a Philosophical Debate, was instrumental in getting my PhD off the ground.
And that last week we talked about the Wikipedia entry on the philosophy of conspiracy theories, in which you make an appearance. Is that's the volume? Because I know David Coady came up a lot on that page. Is that specifically this volume of his that it was referring to?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
that's
it is.
how it seemed. So there you go. More Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre. What the hell am I talking about? Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre episode done. And yeah, interesting to see a bit more contrary, I guess. I mean, we've seen disagreement in the other stuff we've looked at, but that seemed to be a slightly more disagreement than we're used to. But that's it for now. So next week I understand we have an interview of some sort. So
We do. I'll be talking with Byron Clark, who has a YouTube channel which does some excellent work looking at alt-right material in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We will be talking about a recent interview on the Action Zealandia podcast with Kerry Bolton,
right.
who, if you don't remember who Kerry Bolton is, shame on you, New Zealand listeners, and also he's our most prominent right-wing pseudo-intellectual. So we'll be talking a little bit about what he's been up to when being interviewed by our local alt-right group, Action Zealandia. But before then, we've got a patron bonus episode coming up. Of course, we have to deal with the big story, which occurred yesterday morning, that big old explosion in Beirut. Now, did you see... Did you find out about the story before or after you watched a video of the explosion?
No, the explosion videos were the first thing I saw on my Twitter
Yeah,
feed.
I just saw a tweet saying you've got to watch this. And it was the first thing I did waking up, so I did, and then I went,
what the hell was that? Yeah.
Which did give me a lot of memories of the morning of September 12th here, back in 2001. But we'll talk about that later on. So we'll be talking about Beirut. We'll be talking about COVID-19.
Obviously.
We'll be talking a lot about COVID-19, truth be told. And then we've got a fascinating Jacob Wall update.
Yep, he's at it again. Just when you think we won't have anything to talk about, he shows up and does something else stupid.
But I mean, this time he really has done something else. This goes well beyond your usual Jacob Wall information. So we've got that to look forward to.
Yes.
Or at least you've got that.
You've got that to look forward to if you're a patron. And if you are, thank you very much. If you're not a patron, but you're still listening, thank you very much for that as well. But if you'd like to be a patron, go to patreon.com and search for the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy. You get these bonus episodes. You get access to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy Discord, where we broadcast live as we record these things. We do that in New Zealand.
Sometimes people even
Sometimes they do. We do it in New Zealand evening time, which we acknowledge is not the best time for people in other parts of the world, so we're looking at maybe a special one that we do at a more accessible time slot for people in other time zones. But at any rate, you get all that. So if you'd like to do that, feel free. But if you don't, keep on listening and just form our audience and bolster our egos that way. We appreciate that also.
I would also like to point out that a few weeks ago we did ask people to write in if they had issue with the drunk podcast. No one has written in to say they had issue with my drunk podcasting. So I'm assuming it's all go for drunken podcasting in future.
You should be as drunk as possible at all times.
If you don't like drunken podcasting, you do need to get in contact because otherwise it is going to happen again.
We can't stop it, quite frankly.
No, I mean, it's just natural. These things happen.
It's the laws of physics. But anyway, that's the end of this episode, I think. Good old Conspiracy Theory Masterpiece Theatre always keeps the content coming. So until next week, or until a moment from now, and if you happen to be listening to the bonus episode after this, I
Or
think,
you happen to be chaining through a whole bunch
well,
of
yep,
old
you could be
episodes
doing
trying
that.
to catch up.
It could be the future where you are. It could be centuries into the future, frankly, and you've stumbled upon this podcast and now you're binging your way through the whole lot into your subcranial brain implants or however
Imagine
things work.
if we were the only cultural artifact left from
Ooh,
the 21st century.
God, that wouldn't be a good look, to be perfectly
No,
honest.
I mean, that means we have to do a lot more
I
pop
suppose we
culture
do
stuff
have more responsibility, yeah.
to tell
To
people
future
about
generations.
things that we need to go on about the fact there's a Blu-ray release of Split Second coming out, and I'm so excited by the idea.
Yeah, if you are listening from the future, Split Second was a very good film, maybe possibly the best film, and that's all you need to know about movies.
It was the Citizen Kane of movies.
Anyway, I think we're done. I think we're done for now. So I'm just going to say goodbye and leave the rest to you.
And I'm going to say toodly plop plop, hooray!
You've been listening to the Podcaster's Guide to the Conspiracy, starring Josh Addison and Dr. M.R.X. Denton, which is written, researched, recorded and produced by Josh and M. You can support the podcast by becoming a patron via its Podbean or Patreon campaigns. And if you need to get in contact with either Josh or M, you can email them at podcastconspiracy@gmail.com or check their Twitter accounts, Monkey Fluids and Conspiracism.